Welcome to the Mystic-Skeptic radio show and podcast, the program in which we ask the tough questions and explore different alternatives to today's pressing issues, theories, or enigmas. Our show is devoted to the exploration of all things mystical, philosophical, scientific, political, conspiratorial, and cosmic. Join us in an exploration of the Mystic-Skeptic mind space.
This week's show, our guest is Moshe Chertoff, originally from Los Angeles, California, who today is a social and political activist and came to live on a kibbutz or communal farm in the Western Galilee near Lebanon in 1974. He recently retired, and Moshe has had many professions, including a portrait photographer, farmer, an 18-wheel operator, an advisor to a Muslim member of the Knesset, and most recently a senior technical communicator in the medical device industry. He's married with 5 kids and a young woman that him and his wife adopted last year. He's joining us from Kibbutz Shomrat in Western Galilee in the state of Israel. Welcome to our show.
Thank you very much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Thank you.
Hello, Tennessee. Hello, everybody watching.
So we're dealing with a controversial subject. The topic today is Zionism, and it has become a dirty word among American progressives. So, for years I've had struggles on how to handle the Israel-Palestine issue on my show, and it's a very divisive topic, and we want to hear from progressive voices in Israel, and then in the future we might be able to have some members of the Palestinian community, but we just want to the show that is going to play before this one is a defender of the state of Israel that sounds like every other defender of the state of Israel that you hear. And he says that it's all about survival and it's all about accepting people and not being racist. But we have to go a little bit deeper, and we have to go through the history of the state of Israel. So currently I'm reviewing the book, The Lucky One. It's a memoir about persecution in Russia in the 19th century. Or 20th century, and on page 81 it says the following: Kishinev, the first site of a major pogrom in the 20th century, resulted in a worldwide condemnation and mass demonstrations in major cities, New York, London, and Paris. The young youth of the shtetls reacted by creating defense units with proper training. Money was raised to purchase guns, and blacksmiths made iron poles and spikes. Communication was now the telephone, the few that existed, and a network of spies was planted among the pogromists. Some young people sought a political solution and joined revolutionary groups whose focus was to overthrow the Tsar. Thus, the march began towards revolution. Others, such as future Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, left Russia and made their way to Palestine. Their experience in Russia and their belief in socialism led to the creation of the kibbutz, the labor unions, and the self-defense forces. This will become the foundation of a future nation. Ironically, the pogroms created a sense of pride and Jewish nationalism for a people who had no country. So another guest on our show talked about how when people migrated to Palestine at that time, that he cannot judge them for doing that because they were in a bad situation and they had been kicked out from different places or they were being persecuted in Europe. So that, to him, that's not the problem. The problem is what happened after. In your view, is Zionism, like when people say you can be a Jew but not a Zionist, to me it's like a double-handed slap because many Jews are Zionists, but people now assume that if you're a Zionist, you must be a bad person or you support the oppression of other people. To you as a progressive Jew in Israel, what does Zionism mean, and is it connected to that history that I was just mentioning?
Well, that's a good question because the essence of the answer is in the question, what kind of Zionism or what kind of Zionist? And I think people have to understand that almost like in any for any person who follows any philosophy or believes in any philosophy, makes it his way of life, there are different strains, different flavors to Zionism. There was the Zionism before the State of Israel. There is the Zionism since. There was a Zionism that came out of our history of thousands of years of not having lived in this area. It wasn't a state. It was a few kingdoms. There were various. Well, this is one of those places in the world where the most forces traveled through it and ruled it probably than almost anywhere else in the world. It still is a crossroads, but much less in times since major transportation has been developed, with planes in particular, but with boats, so people could bypass. They didn't have to take the land route from Asia or to Asia. In any case, there is a religious Zionism, which is obviously based in the history because there were only Jews. There weren't different types of Jews or Jews who believed in different types of Judaism. You either were a Jew at the time or you weren't. And as time developed, there became different breakdowns or different movements within Judaism that included, to begin with, the categorization of those who were the only types of Jews back then as being either Orthodox, eventually became Orthodox, or ultra-Orthodox, and Hasidim. And there are various types of each of those, Hasidim and Orthodox and whatever. There are the conservatives who are less, I don't know exactly how to say it in the proper terms. Perhaps you could help me with that, but
Religious,
less strict in their observance of the religion, so they would be conservative. One step more liberal in their approach to the religion would be the Reform Jews, and you have Reconstructionist Jews, and you have people like me who are Jews but not religious at all. I was born and raised in a Reform temple in Los Angeles. When I was around 18 years old, I happened to be fortunate that this was the period in the United States of the youth revolution. Black became beautiful, and I was very happy about how things were progressing at the time. And I decided to ask myself the question, if Black can be beautiful, why can't being Jewish be beautiful? And I started to try to find out, well, wait a second, what does it mean to be Jew? Where am I going? Who am I really? So my culmination class, as we called it, the 12th graders at the religious school where I was brought up by my parents sent me there. They kind of screwed up my plans for Little League and being a professional baseball player, because on Saturdays they would send me to Temple. But anyway, we took over our culmination year and we told the rabbis, no, we're not going to study the things that you had planned. Here's what we want to study. And we gave them a curriculum, which meant we decided to bring in a representative of almost every different type of being a Jew that you could. So we had a Hasid, we had a Chabad rabbi, or a certain strain of Orthodoxy that came in. We had people from the Hashomer Hatzayir's Socialist Zionist Youth Movement, which is still a movement from around the world in many countries throughout the world that brought people to live on the kibbutz in Israel. And please, by the way, stop me along the way if I happen to mention any terms that either come from the Hebrew or the Arabic and aren't necessarily understood. For instance, just kibbutz, for people who don't know, is a communal farm, of which there are like 250 some odd communal farms like this, or in the plural, kibbutzim in Israel, spread from the very farthest north point of the country, the very farthest south, and everywhere in between. We had many different people come in, and I eventually found out that I went through actually a religious period in which I'd wrap tefillin. I would go through the various traditions of the religious tradition of trying to become a religious Jew. And after a while, I came to the realization that I didn't really believe in a God, so there was no real point in my being religious. And I didn't want to be, what's the word? I didn't want to do it superficially. At the time, I was looking for my roots, and we actually formed in Los Angeles what was called the Jewish Radical Community. It was actually my older brother was among the founders of the Jewish Radical Community, and people who were progressives and tried to find the religiosity in Judaism that met their way of life and their thinking in terms of where they lived. They weren't living in a Jewish country or anything. So I eventually found the fact that to live on a kibbutz, which was more today, it is less an egalitarian society. In other words, an equal approach to the sexes, to almost everything, that respects everyone of any color, race, religion, way of thinking equally. In other words, we weren't on kibbutzim more back then than now. I should stop right here and just say that kibbutzim have privatized, instead of being totally socialist the way we were back then, we privatized, which also brought on all sorts of social changes and adjustments. But in any case, at the time, there was no requirement or understanding that a woman would be working in the kitchen or with the children. Everything was open to everybody, and whatever a person felt like they wanted to do and could do, so they had the chance to do it. They could work with the cows in a dairy, or they could go out and plow the fields, or they could work with the children if they wanted. I managed the dining room, the communal dining room, the kibbutz, 3 meals a day for 350 people. It's quite a show. That's gone, among other socialist enterprises that we once held high. That's gone. The children's houses used to be not just daycare centers, but we raised our children there. My kids went to sleep in a children's house with a guard there, just to be aware of any problems there might be and come take care of them, so that the parents could sleep at home, wake up at 4 a.m. to take my truck down to the Negev desert and come back around lunchtime. At 4 o'clock, the kids would come home. We would bring them home, and we would have 4 quality hours of parents and children together before I would take them back to the dining room for dinner and then to the children's house for repeating the cycle. So I also worked in a children's house. I was a caretaker for kindergarten kids. So there was really a striving for equality, although we know that no one is actually equal. Nonetheless, that was the way of life that brought me here, because it was different. It wasn't just a commune. It was a commune based on a Jewish history. Before I came here, I was of the understanding about the occupation at the time. We didn't call it the occupation, we called it the West Bank, conquered territory, Gaza, conquered territory, Golan Heights, the same. And I would not live in any of those areas. Although the movement of our kibbutzim that exists throughout the entire country, we refuse to build any of these settlements. They're not really settlements, communities. We refused to build these communities in the West Bank, for instance, or in Gaza. And there were 2 that wanted to start near the Golan Heights, and they had fields in the Golan Heights. And we told them, as a movement, we'll be happy to help you with that. That's fine. But should you need to give back your territory, your land, or even your houses, because it is let's say, an issue that would prevent peace with Syria, you have to be of the understanding that's what you're going to have to do. So in other words, as you see behind me, I have a Turkish aqueduct behind me. Those are the hills of the Galilee behind, with the Kfar Yassif and the Druze village of Yarka and other. We live in the Western Galilee. The Western Galilee is about 50% Arab, as opposed to the rest of the country, which is mostly Jewish. This is the kind of Zionism that I wanted, to work the fields, to be around people all around me who were Arabs. There's a Christian village not far from here, of people from Christians from all over the world, mainly Germany and Holland. I don't discriminate against anybody for any reason. I try not to hold any prejudice that would make me relate to people in a negative way. I look at the differences between people as the spice of life. I love different types of food. I love different languages. I love ethnomusicology. I'm into all sorts of different types of music. These are the things that interest me. But how would I like to live? The community. It was really good. So my Zionism was one of communal Zionism. It isn't the Zionism of Rabbi Meir Kahane, who based it on protecting the Jewish people everywhere and anywhere as a result of the suffering of the Holocaust. I don't base my Zionism on suffering, but rather on a goal for the future. We call the kibbutz an experiment that has yet to fail. It's been very close to failing a few times, but the idea was that we would, in the very beginning, we put these kibbutzim purposefully in the middle of nowhere. We would go out and be in the middle of the desert or in some mountain in the Galilee or somewhere. And the discussion was, well, should we be a part of the state of Israel or an island unto ourselves and self-sufficient, which was a really beautiful idea, to be able to grow your own food and everything you needed and take care of all of your needs. But we decided to become part of the establishment of the state of Israel. Our children and we went into the army. We went to the universities and married people from outside and whatever. But this is my Zionism. My Zionism, I came about with in the late 60s. This was after the 1967 war in which Israel conquered territory beyond the 1949 armistice lines. And at the time in 1967, or better, even more so, 1968, after we'd already been holding these territories for some time, with thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who weren't Israelis, they definitely weren't Jewish. What were they? And slowly but surely, for economic reasons, mainly, in my opinion, we did not use these territories to broker a peace as like a trade of, okay, we're leaving, but we want to live in peace. So now what do? We never really got there, because what happened was the various industrial and agricultural entities throughout the country realized, hey, we've got a really cheap source of labor here. Wow. If there was one thing that Israel was missing, we were a small country. So we needed lots of working hands. And many of the people who came mainly from the European countries were highly educated. They weren't into getting their hands dirty and doing the menial labor that was also required. So we had people to work in the fields and industry. And it seemed like it was a good deal. Look, the Palestinians are making 5-10 times more than they ever would have had they stayed in Jordan at the time. There was no Palestine at the time as a country. There still isn't. But the land that we had conquered was from the Jordanians, the West Bank. The Golan Heights was from the Syrians. We conquered the Sinai Desert and Gaza from the Egyptians. And I'm only talking in terms that relate to after 1948, the War of Independence. There was no real border of Gaza before then, before the establishment of the State of Israel. But my Zionism didn't have to do with either conquering more land or being a ruler to the other people living around me. My goal was to live with the people around me in a mutuality. And in the Western Galilee, that's pretty much the case. We actually live together very well. And what you see in the news about terrorist attacks, so to speak, just in the last few days, there was a rabbi in Petah Tikva, which is not far from the West Bank, but also very close to Tel Aviv. A rabbi was stabbed to death by a Palestinian worker who had an actual official state permit to come from the Palestinian territories into Israel to work. And he'd been working for 15 or 16 years in Israel, but one day, and we still don't know why, he decided to go on a rampage and killed somebody. So the term terror becomes muddy when that kind of activity takes place beyond the borders of Israel. I know I've gotten away from the idea of Zionism right here, but just to finish the thought and show how complex these issues are, when a person within the state of Israel goes and murders anyone, or even tries to murder anyone, or plants bombs or whatever, this is considered terrorism. When a person does that in occupied territory, and the target of such attacks would be against civilians, or I think it's even a soldier, let's say, who is unarmed, that's still considered terrorism. But when that kind of attack takes place against an armed soldier, an Israeli, in the West Bank, which is not officially part of Israel yet, the person is considered a freedom fighter. Well, that's nice to say for all of us who understand that, but most Israelis would still call that a terror attack. And we have to make that distinction. It's a touchy issue, let's put it that way. Other people would look at Israel as being a terrorist state in general, just for even being here, or especially since 1967 for taking over territory, and especially since unfortunately I say we, but it is the state of Israel, since we have been taking private Palestinian land for developing settlements or industrial areas or whatever in the West Bank in occupied territory. That could also be considered terrorism because it's threatening the lives and making life miserable for the average Palestinian who has no control over his or her destiny. They don't have representation in a parliament until the Palestinian Authority was established. And even since then, many will argue the fact that the Palestinian Authority is corrupt and doesn't necessarily represent the Palestinians, although it is the only real body that does represent them officially, both in international terms and in internal terms after there were elections. So the whole idea of Zionism has, although it was already multifaceted back before the State of Israel became more developed, more complex since then, and then became really messy once the occupation started. So I don't know if I addressed the answer, if that was a proper answer to your question. I went on a few different directions there. Is there anything else you would like to hear about Zionism that isn't necessarily clear to our listeners? Not everybody understands the situations.
I'm going to bring up all the issues that I hear coming from the news programs that are featured on the station, from progressive voices all around the U.S., that there's a problem of legitimacy, that somehow the state of Israel is illegitimate because of who was supporting it when it was created. And when you and I talked previously, you mentioned that it wasn't the U.S. or even Britain that supported the creation of the State of Israel. It was other European powers. But I want to know if you know anything about the call for nationalism among Palestinians, because you mentioned something that is usually said by conservative groups, that there was no Palestine, or that the Palestinian people didn't have a land or a nation. Is that really true? And how do you have two competing fervors? And that's what people sometimes miss, is that the same fervor for the Holy Land that Muslims and Arabs have is the fervor that Jews had for centuries. So to dismiss one and pick the other one, that's a form of ethnic cleansing in a sense, because you're saying that people who are connected to a land should give that up and pass it on to somebody else, no matter who it is. I didn't say that.
Okay.
No, but that's what people say, and
right.
and it creates this sense of, the good guys and the bad guys. But as you and I have discovered, there's good and bad guys all around, and there's
everywhere.
The lack of understanding is what creates ethnocentrism and racism, as you had shared in our conversation. So before we even go there, in your interactions with Arab members of the Holy Land, have they mentioned how their sense of nationality came, and was that they felt that was taken away from them, or are they, in a sense, as you mentioned, the kibbutzim being little pockets of utopian society? Do Christian Arabs and Muslim Arabs that live in modern day state of Israel, do they see themselves almost like a reservation, or in the way that the U.S. has 500 nations within a nation? And because in my class that I took about state and religion, is that there's a sense of not bothering the local population at times. And when you mentioned that the number of Arabs who actually vote in Israeli elections is very low, is it because they stay apart and they don't want to be part of the system? And is there kibbutzim who are completely independent and they might pay taxes or allow their kids to go to the military, but are they in opposition to the whole system?
Mm-hmm. Wow. You've crossed a lot of points here in the question, so I'm going to try to go back and touch them one by one. I hope our listeners or viewers don't get the impression that I'm trying to dodge the question. I'm just trying to be as comprehensive in my answer as I can. So when you said that, I'd mentioned that it wasn't only the United States and Britain or the Western countries that created Israel, it was the Europeans also, and in particular, well, they didn't, none of them created the state of Israel. The state of Israel was actually created by the people who were striving to create a state. What they eventually did was they gave their approval through a vote in the United Nations that divided the country into two states, a partition plan that would leave a state of Palestine and a state of Israel, and neither of which would be contiguous. And Israel approved the plan, and the various Arab entities in the area did not. That included the Palestinians and the neighboring states that already existed. But it wasn't any of those entities that created the state, actually. And when I say that there wasn't a Palestine, I don't think I said that, but there wasn't a state of Palestine. The name of Palestine has been around since Roman times. And there have been various names to this region, to this land, including Canaan and others. I'm not going to address that as much as I'm going to address the situation starting with the establishment of the state of Israel, which you can either look at it as a positive or a negative development. But I think that's the point from which we have to start addressing the issues if we're going to try to look forward toward ending our conflict and creating a better society, not only for both Israelis and Palestinians, but for the rest of our region, which includes Arabs, Iranians, and others, and also for the rest of the world, because whether it is accurate or not that this conflict is preventing world peace or preventing a proper world order, for instance, in 1973 after the Yom Kippur War or the October War, whichever you prefer to call it, there was an oil embargo against the West. And I remember living in Chicago at the time and standing for 45 minutes in my car, standing in a line to fill up for gas. And people were dying, freezing in their cars, freezing to death when their gasoline emptied. So it's, again, a bit of a complex thing, but I definitely never said that there was never a Palestine. But also you mentioned the ideas of good guys and bad guys. I don't use that terminology. I don't believe that there is such a thing as a bad guy or a good guy. We're all humans. George Bush, the son, I think, was one of those people who tried to make everything very, very clear and simple to people. They're the bad guys. We got to get those bad guys. We're the good guys. We got to help those good guys. I don't think there is such a thing. And I think that we all have to look at each other as different, having different understandings of how we each see various situations in different ways. And I have to be willing to understand that they'd see it differently than I do. Even my own kids see things differently than I do. And that's fine. So obviously the guy who lives next door to me sees it differently. And obviously somebody who lives across the river sees it different than me. That doesn't make him bad or good or his view bad or good. That just means we have to deal with it and try to see how we get along and see how we move forward and progress towards something which is mutual and positive. To the Christians and Muslims, I have Christian and Muslim friends, many. As you mentioned in the introduction, I was an advisor to a Muslim member of the Israeli Knesset. Just to give a little description of my friend, whose name is Zohair Bahalul, he was a member of the Labor Party, or he joined the Labor Party. And he grew up in the city of Haifa, and then moved to the mixed city of Haifa, and then moved to the mixed city across the bay to the city of Akko, which is 2 or 3 miles from my kibbutz. Zohair is a wonderful man. He says very clearly, I'm not a Zionist, but that doesn't mean I don't love the state that I live in, which is an amazing state. It offers a democracy and an opportunity for anybody who wants to take part to progress and be pretty much anything they want to be. That sounds a bit naive. And as time went by in his term in the Knesset, he found that to be less and less true because of our more racist and fascistic government that in the end, as far as he was concerned, passed what is called the nation state law, which in essence gave absolute priority to anything Jewish within the state of Israel. Now, I don't look at Israel as the Jewish state, and I don't want to live in a Jewish state. I want to live in a modern and democratic state, which, just like I would love to have a Palestinian state next to Israel, living in peace and cooperation, that will be a homeland for the Palestinian people, I hope. But I also hope that it will be democratic. But there are, let's say, 3 main groups of Arabs within Israel. There are the Christians, of which there are a few different factions of Christianity. There are the Muslims, of which there are the 2 main types of Muslims, although there actually is a third that live in the Haifa area. And then there are the Druze, D-R-U-Z-E, who actually started in Egypt, but mainly today live in Lebanon, Syria, and Israel. Among them, there are various types of ways that they relate to Israel. For instance, the Druze, in their belief, are subservient to or take part in every country that they live in. In other words, the Druze in Lebanon consider themselves Lebanese. They serve in the Lebanese army. The Druze in Syria, up until the recent civil war and conflict and things that broke Syria into little pieces, they served in the Syrian army. They consider themselves loyal Syrian citizens, and within Israel the same. So almost all young men who are Druze serve in the Israeli army, and some of them are more patriotic. If you will ask them, they consider themselves to be absolutely more patriotic than most Jews, because it's like they have a point to prove. And there is the misconception that most of the Druze are therefore right-wing and conservative and will go along with anything that the government of Israel says. That is not the case. I attended the first Druze peace conference in the village called Yarka, which you can see in the background of behind behind the Turkish aqueduct. And there are more and more Druze who oppose the policies of our government than ever before, because they realize that they are being marginalized as Arabs. And although they never really wanted to be only Arabs, they wanted to be citizens of Israel just like anybody else. Unfortunately, many Jews within Israel relate to them specifically as Arabs and therefore discriminate against them. Christians, one would think, I don't know, maybe other people don't think that way, but possibly one would think that because people are Christian, we would be more able to accept them than Muslims. That's not necessarily the case. among the leaders of the PLO and other Palestinian groups that fought against the state of Israel, there are Christians and there are Muslims. And in Israel, it's the same thing. Most villages are either Christian or Muslim or Druze. There are some villages that are mixed. The city of Akko is totally mixed between Jews and Arabs of different origins. By the way, the city of Akko is an amazing place where mutuality and respect it's absolutely amazing. And anybody who wants to see how that works, Zoher Bahalul is my friend who's the member of Knesset, is from Akko. So it also is complex. It also is a rainbow of flavors and ideas and also narratives. I mean, I've made a point of trying to understand what these people who live around me will tell me about what happened in 1948 and before, what happened since 1948. There are actually various realities, various actions that were taken either by the leaders of their own communities or by the leaders of the Jewish forces who were trying to establish the borders of a state that was just established during this War of Independence. So it's a very difficult and complex answer, as almost everything around here is. More and more, by the way, there are more and more Muslim Arabs who are volunteering to serve in the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, our army. Many people have will challenge that name, Defense Forces, but yes, that's the name up until now. Just another example of my issues with the state of Israel, for instance, is our flag. Our flag doesn't represent the state of Israel. Our flag represents the people of Israel, the Jews. It has a Magen David, a Jewish star in the center, with blue colors, as are the blue colors of the Talit.
The prayer shawls for those.
The prayer shawl, and it also has two stripes on it, which are also symbolic of the prayer shawl. Now, yes, the majority today, and for many years, the majority of the state of Israel has been Jewish. So most Jews won't even think twice about it. Of course, that's our flag. To me, it doesn't speak for the 20% of our citizens who are not Jews. Same is true of our national anthem called Hatikva, or the Hope. And it's a song that speaks of 2,000 years of yearning and looking Israel-ward, Jerusalem-ward in particular, toward Jerusalem for the last 2,000 years. Well, that's nice, unless you weren't. So here is one of the main problems that makes everything both more complex and problematic at the same time, and that is, this is a state of Israel. This does not necessarily, no, I'll make that very clear. It does not represent the Jewish people. The Jewish people did not vote to have a state of Israel, nor do they vote to support it, nor does Israel have the right to assume that it represents anybody other than the people, the citizens of the state of Israel who vote for that government. So particularly since 1977, when the Labor Party and the Israel Workers' Party and the United Workers' Party in Israel were thrown out, and the right wing came in 1977 with Menachem Begin and others, led by Menachem Begin. The attitude has changed, the approach has changed, and it's been one more of nationalism and less of being all-encompassing and representing its citizens, but rather looking back at the Holocaust and saying, this is why we must have a country. And the Holocaust is going to govern everything that we decide upon. And it's going to decide also, it's going to also be our reason for almost everything. It's like a justification. Now, I don't think anyone would deny that the Holocaust, or first of all, there are people who deny the Holocaust, but I don't think that anybody who understands that there was the Holocaust in which my family members perished in Poland, and uh, those who recognize the fact that there was a Holocaust and understand that many of the people who died as a result of the fact that they had nowhere else to go. And even the United States was offered to take many Poles and Czechs and Hungarians and other Jews throughout Europe. But the United States said, excuse me, where are they from? Poland? Let's see. No, we've reached our quota for Poles. We can't take any more, thank you. And as a result, millions of my people died. So I'm not saying that therefore we are totally justified in everything and anything that we want to do. But yes, I believe that we are entitled to a homeland. Yes, this homeland has been more or less, I'm saying more or less because it isn't absolute, but more or less empty of Jews for centuries. There were Jews that lived here throughout the centuries, but they were not the majority of the people living here. Nonetheless, there is no other either natural or deserving place on earth to have a national a homeland for the Jewish people other than Israel. We were offered Uganda at a certain point to try to defuse the issue of living with the people around us or living against the people around us, which was not something I would ascribe to. The joke goes that Moses was a stutterer, and when God talked to him about where to go, where the Jewish people should go, so he started saying and he stuttered his way through it, and God said, "Oh, Canaan," and that's the reason we don't live in Canada. But that doesn't work in real life. In any case, love you, Canada. Don't take me wrong. I love Canada. But anyway,
let me stop you there because we're still.
Excuse me?
Let me stop you for a minute. So we're still dealing
Sure.
with a lot of issues, and before we get attacked, I don't know if you got to see the YouTube video about the conversation about Bernie Sanders and his support or lack thereof of Israel, but we get attacked that we were pushing socialist propaganda and anti-Israel rhetoric. What we know is that you can ask questions, and the best way to get to the bottom of something is to go through it. Now it has become that anybody questions what's going on over there is anti-Semitic or anti-Israel, and without this nuance that there are certain things that you support and certain things that you don't, just like the U.S., that just because you're a citizen of the U.S., are you unpatriotic if you don't support a certain war or a certain type of intervention in another place? But I felt that for the years that I've been involved in the Jewish community, that progressives either don't want to talk about the state of Israel because they know it's a very hot button, or they jump sides really quick so they don't seem like they're being prejudicial towards other groups. So how do you, like when someone says, if you were to travel to Europe and they find out that you are Israeli and that you're proud of being an Israeli, or that you are a Zionist in your own way, and they completely dismiss you as someone who's supporting a negative regime, how would you respond to being someone who might not be in favor of the BDS movement and might not sign that you stand against all of the things that Israel has done for the past 70 years? How do you give people enough information for you to hold your ground without them wanting to knock over your whole premise?
Okay. First of all, make it very clear, I consider myself a progressive, both in terms of my worldview, in terms of Israel, and in terms of the United States. I considered myself Bernie's main man in Israel. I was his, I tried to push Bernie's ideas and his candidacy, both in 2016 and recently. I was in touch with his brother who lives in the United Kingdom, and to the extent where when Bernie spoke, I'd have to double check that my lips weren't moving, because he pretty much says almost everything and anything that I would say regarding Israel and regarding everything. And I think we have to make a distinction here. You mentioned the term anti-Israeli or anti-Israel. I'll use the pro-Israel. And I contend that to be actually and fully pro-Israel, you must also be pro-Palestine. And the reason I say that is in a conflict, in this conflict in particular, no one side can win, as we saw in 1967. If one side win, both sides in essence lose. I don't consider our occupation or our progress as a result of that occupation to be beneficial. I believe that our children, and we and our children, have been negatively influenced by having to police so many people who never wanted to be a part of the state of Israel. And unlike the Palestinians living within Israel, who are citizens of Israel, the Palestinians in the occupied territory don't have a voice. They don't have any control over their own destiny whatsoever. You could say that since the establishment of the Palestinian Authority, they have a certain, or they have a right to have control of their own destiny, but that hasn't been really the case. But let's put that aside in the meantime. So I believe to be pro-Israel, you have to also be pro-Palestine. And the inverse is true. If you're anti-Israel, you're also anti-Palestine. One of these days, we're going to live in peace side by side or together in one country, or however it's going to work out. But in the final analysis, they're not leaving and we're not leaving. So let's cut to the chase. What is the point in trying to be either anti-Israel or anti-Palestine? How about looking at it as being just like any other country? Are the French anti-German? Not anymore. French live as very good friends with Germany and vice versa, despite having gone through two horrific world wars, not even just a regional conflict. The World War was based in Germany twice, but France and Germany, Belgium and France, all of these countries have understood that there is more value to finding mutuality and a way to exist together in peace and cooperation than find the differences between us and say, oh, it's because you're German or because you're French, you obviously. No, that won't work. It doesn't work, it won't work. So I know of the term progressive except regarding Israel or for Israel. There's a term for it. I forget exactly the acronym for it, but the abbreviation for it. But I know of many people throughout the world, in particular in the United States, Jews who consider themselves progressive and are even Bernie lovers, are consider themselves socialists or whatever, until it comes to Israel. And they say, oh, no, no, no. Now, there is this knee-jerk reaction among Jews. I call it a justified paranoia. I mean, let's face it, half of our people, 6 million people, were murdered because they were Jews. So there are those of us still alive who both, I don't remember it, I wasn't alive at the time, but I do understand and know of family members who perished during the Holocaust. Therefore, let's put it this way, the subject is extremely touchy, just as the subject of slavery is very touchy, especially to people of color in the United States and in many of the countries where slavery existed. There's no question about it that people whose ancestors did not suffer from slavery look at it differently than those who, yeah, that's the reason they were here, was they were brought here for slavery. They can't not deal with it on a different level than people who are not of color. And therefore you have this disparity in the United States where it's finally coming around to an understanding by most everyone who has any senses that you have to relate differently than you have for hundreds of years to a certain people. The same thing goes to regarding everything regarding Israel. And if you want to be progressive, you should be progressive. I'm offended by and very deeply hurt by the fact that progressive Jews in particular in the United States, but in general, that progressives in the United States don't support progressives in Israel. We are doing amazing things together with progressives. It doesn't matter if they're Arabs or Jews. I belong to a number of organizations that are working towards this goal of mutuality. And these would be considered progressive ideas, but not by Jews who have this knee-jerk reaction. it generally has to do with their position in the political scale in the United States. If they are right-wingers, then they are generally more, I will support Israel no matter what. And more left-wing would say, yeah, but there's this occupation. There are these various laws in Israel that don't apply to all of its citizens, but only either to the Jews or whatever. So I don't accept that view, and I'm hurt that the right wing in the United States, in particular the right wing religious United States, they have this existing framework in which they get together, which is wonderful. Synagogues, temples, where it's wonderful they get together either on a daily or a weekly basis, or if they're, not adherent to all of the laws of Judaism, they get together 2, 3, 4 times a year. And in that framework, they discuss. And the obvious discussion since 1967 has been Israel and to support Israel. I think everyone should support Israel, but I also think everyone should support Palestine. There's no difference. I mean, I don't want to be against anybody's desire for self-determination for a nation. And obviously that becomes problematic in countries where they are very allowed to secede from the United States of America and have their own countries. It's kind of problematic because as non-contiguous as Palestine appears to be at the time, right now, same would be true about Native Americans. But that doesn't mean they don't deserve equal rights within that country or the self-determination somehow. You have to make you have to approach their rights as minorities in a different way than you relate to your rights as a majority. And that's one of the bases of democracy, is protecting the minorities. And this is where American Jewry still has to get over its automatic approval of everything and anything Israel does. We have to be, just like I can be against the policies of a Trump government, that doesn't make me anti-American. To be opposed to the policies of a Netanyahu or right-wing government in Israel doesn't make you automatically anti-Israel. And even if you are opposed to the policies, and even if you consider yourself anti-Israel, that doesn't make you automatically anti-Semitic. People make these assumptions and link them together as if they're a continuance of a certain chain. They're not. And people should realize that you're allowed to have different ideas about different things. Yeah. And different ideas about different countries, and especially different ideas about different governments within those countries. So all of that is valid. And I'm hoping that progressives everywhere will oppose the policies of a right-wing government in Israel, just like the right wing opposed the policies of the Rabin government, who is moving towards peace and a Palestinian state and an end of our occupation and the conflict.
Let's flip that. What about the people that say that if you don't support BDS, you hate the Palestinians and you're happy with their plight?
Okay. I know this conflict personally because my brother is a supporter of BDS. I am not. That doesn't mean we don't love each other. That doesn't mean he's right or wrong, or I'm right or wrong. I've looked at the goals of BDS, and I agree with almost all of them. I agree. We should end the occupation immediately. We should be giving full and equal rights to all Palestinians and others who live in Israel who are not Jewish. And we should be allowing the right of return. We should recognize the right of return, which doesn't necessarily mean that every Palestinian who wants to come live in the home where his ancestors lived will immediately be approved and will have hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Palestinian refugees who are located in various countries around the world all of a sudden coming to Israel and will change the entire demography of the country, the demographics of it. Doesn't mean it won't. But these are things that need to be discussed. These are things that need to be approved, negotiated. And I don't approve of BDS because, as I stated before, I want your investment, particularly in the things that are good and progressive about Israel. And there is lots. I don't want you to just judge Israel as one thing, like we today would not judge America as one thing. It can switch in November. I hope it will. But these things aren't unidimensional. And I would like you to help me and help us progressives in Israel overturn the what I call Likudnikin rule. Likudnikin being, Likud is the main right-wing party of Israel, and Republican, the main right-wing party in the United States. I believe them to be one single entity and working together with the same sugar daddy, Sheldon Adelson, who pays for everybody's candidacy, who's a right-winger and doesn't represent me whatsoever. BDS, I don't want that. What you're doing is punishing also the left in Israel and the progressives in Israel. Let's somehow make a distinction between those who approve of or participate in occupation and those who don't. I refuse to serve in occupied territory. I went to Lebanon the first time in 1982 with the understanding that we were at war because this is a war of survival. All of us went. And I was stationed in Beirut. I actually flew into Beirut airport, not with permission of the Lebanese necessarily, and not with a passport, with a gun and being a soldier. And the second time I got called up, I said, wait a second, this is okay, this has been going on too long. And by the third call up came, I said, no, I'm not coming. You have no right to call me up now. You said in the beginning this would be a 48-hour incursion. Then you said it would only be to the Litani River. And then you said it would only be for 2 weeks. And you said it would only be to the outskirts of Beirut. Here I am sitting in Beirut. And you're going to tell me it's not all of Beirut. Eventually, I was one of the last Israeli soldiers left in Beirut because they forgot to tell us they were leaving. And so I was lucky to be able to drive and drove my way out of Beirut up to the hills with my other 2 soldiers. And after we left and were finished with our reserve stint, Israel went back and conquered all of Beirut. So since then, almost all of the Israeli left has understood that we've been lied to throughout history, and we need to stop believing the government line, no matter what, no matter who. We have to be aware of what's going on, understand the complexity of it all, and make our own judgments as human beings and parents and members of a democratic society, and that we have a responsibility not to go along with policies and implementation of those policies that are wrong. Defend my country? Of course I would defend my country. That's what an army is for. But my army now is not defending my borders. My army, among other things, is defending my borders, our borders. But it is patrolling the West Bank as policemen, because Israeli law says that an Israeli in the West Bank, whether he lives there or not, cannot be touched by a soldier, but only a policeman because he's a citizen. But regarding the Palestinians, soldiers deal with the Palestinians. That's not why that's not why my children have gone into the IDF. That's not why I went into the IDF. A soldier should be maintaining and protecting the borders from attack and from aggressive forces from the outside. Police should be taking care of internal things. That's the problem, that there's this gray area since 1967 of occupied territory that says, well, it's kind of Israel. We're going to make it Israel. No, it's wrong. And I was deeply hurt by the fact that the 2 governments in which my party took part, the Rabin government of the middle 1990s and the Barak government of 2000, 1999 until 2001, we didn't reduce our footprint in occupied territory. We didn't make the move to get out of occupation. Actually, we played a passive role in allowing more occupation forces, more settlers to come and live on Palestinian land that obviously was not ours. It didn't belong to Jordan anymore since the king of Jordan said, no, I don't need that. Thank you very much. I'm out of here, which is more or less what he did one day, which complicated matters even further for the Palestinians there. But anyway, getting back to the idea of BDS, I hope you don't boycott all of Israel. I hope if you want to boycott everything and anything that is a product of occupation, Sure. I also oppose it. I don't drive through the West Bank unless it's for condolences visits, which I paid condolences visits to Jewish families who had one family had their son who was murdered at the entrance to his community. I've also paid condolences visits and to Palestinian families. I've gone to Ramallah to sit with Abu Mazen in the Muqata, in the head of the Palestinian Authority. I will go there only for specific reasons, and as least often as possible. I don't want to be a pawn in anybody's game. If somebody attacks me, I don't want somebody to make a reprisal in my name. I don't want to be part of that. Within Israel, I'll travel anywhere and everywhere. And I'm part of a group of people, an organization called the opposite of price tag. The word for price tag in Hebrew is tag mechir, and we call our organization Tag Me'ir. So as opposed to price tag, it's like a tag of light. We go to people who have suffered from racism, and in particular attacks, but also just racism, acts of racism, spray painting Jewish slogans in Arab villages, and people who had their tires punctured, whatever. It happens within Israel and in the occupied territories. Our organization goes to these places and condones people who are bereaved. We go to support people who have been attacked. I was the initiator of a 3-year stand here at at an intersection at the main coastal road about a few hundred yards from where I live. We stood there for 3 years and handed out 500 flowers each time we stood there. And throughout the 3 years that we stood, we handed out 42,500 flowers in the name of tolerance and against racism. This is the kind of thing that I want Americans to support and not just have a blanket boycott of. This is not South Africa. It's not exactly the same. I understand how some people might believe that it is. There should be no distinction. I don't think that it is the same situation. Let's not forget, there have been 3 elections in the last year. Netanyahu did not win any of them, meaning it is not just such a simple majority that he has and that all of Israel are right-wingers. And no, we actually had a coalition that was the majority of the country in the last elections. Unfortunately, the leaders of the people who we voted for went back on their support of what we voted for, and so they actually joined the government in the end with Netanyahu. But the country is more or less divided 50-50, almost 50-50, and it depends on what issue you ask. That division kind of sways. So Israel is not one thing, just like any country is not one unified identity or political direction. And I would appeal to people not to support BDS, but rather to support the progressives in Israel. Jews who don't want to support BDS have 2 avenues that they often take. One is to just, I don't want to hear about Israel. No, too difficult. Don't talk to me about it. I've had enough of Israel. Thank you very much. Talk to somebody else about Israel. That's one way of dealing with it. The other way of dealing with it is, yeah, I don't want it done in my name. I'll do anything and everything I can to stop what Israel is doing to the Palestinian people and to the world order. I don't buy either of those. If you want to have an influence on ending our conflict with the Palestinians, if you want to help a Palestinian state come about, you can't create a state of Palestine, neither can I. What I can do, and hopefully what you would help me do, is to end our occupation, get us out of occupied territory in a meaningful way that will support those who would like to create a democratic state that will live in harmony and mutuality with us, not the way we left Gaza, which was a scorched earth policy, where Sharon just decided one day, I'm going to be out of here. And he didn't prepare the groundwork for having someone instead of Hamas who would help take care of their citizens and give the people of Gaza an alternative that was better than just attacking Israel all the time, or suffering in the situation they exist, or being neglected by the Bush government of the time, who said, yeah, we want fair elections in Gaza before we'll support Gaza. And then the elections took place and Hamas won, and then Bush said, no, that's not what I meant. That doesn't work. In other words, these things are both complex and need to have forethought that will prevent conflict and promote an end to conflict.
I was looking up the statement from Seth Rogen. I don't know if you're familiar with what happened with the Jewish comedian. He got in trouble because, I don't know why people care so much what a stoner kid says, but he said, as a Jewish person, I was fed a huge amount of lies about Israel my entire life. You mentioned that you were fed lies when you were going to the incursions in Lebanon. What about the history of the place? Do you think that young people can see through propaganda and that's why they become the solution? Or that's just his lack of interest in the issue, and if he was more interested and more involved, he would be supporting your group in Israel instead of just bashing the whole thing?
Obviously, I would like the support of all Jews around the world. I would like the support of everyone in the world. That's not the way things work. I'm not sure I would use the term having been fed lies throughout history or whatever. I try to be accepting to other people's views of themselves, of their family, of their people, of their country, and understand that they view it differently than me. That doesn't mean we can't come out of our differences together. I have friends who are extreme right-wingers, yet we worked together in high tech, and we became very, very good friends. And when I retired and left, we cried that we would miss each other. And I've actually had meaningful discussions with Hilltop youth, who are considered the most radical of the Jewish nationalists in the country. I've had meaningful discussions with them that they didn't expect. I mean, they attacked me when I came to help defend the father and grandfather of the family that was burned to death in a firebomb that was thrown into their house in the village of Dura. And when the young man, who was a minor at the time, was being brought to court for, they wanted to give him home arrest as opposed to staying in detention in a detention center because he was a minor. His friends, the Hilltop youth, came there and started yelling at the grandfather and the one son who survived and was burned horribly also. But anyway, instead of letting the process happen, they came there and started yelling and protesting, and they were yelling at him, Ali al-Ha'esh, in other words, Ali on the grill. Jews would say something like that to a family member who lost his entire family. It didn't make sense. So we went there, and the next time it came to court, and we stood on one side, the police put a barricade between us and the Hilltop youth, and we sang songs of peace and reconciliation and love. And they were yelling at us all the time. And one guy kept pointing at me and said, you're a fraidy cat. You're a fraidy cat. He'd say it with a smile, and he was like trying to get my goat. And I kept looking and said, what are you talking? What? I don't get it. When it was all over and the cameras left and the barricades went down, I crossed the line, so to speak, and went over to him, surrounded by about 7 or 8 of his friends. And I said, what did you mean? Why did you keep pointing at me and saying, you're a scaredy cat, you're a scaredy cat? I don't mind if you want to call me being it. I just want to understand. I said, I continued, which is usually the best ammunition I have for somebody who attacks me like that. I say, I don't know what your father looks like, but was he with me in Beirut in 1982? Or was he with me when we were on the border with Syria all those years? I did 22 years in the IDF. And I served with one of the best units, or considered one of the best units in the Israeli armed forces for 11 years. I didn't see your father there. I don't understand. What do you mean? And once he understood that I'm not a traitor to the state of Israel necessarily, we started having a decent discussion. I started off the discussion by saying, could we talk? And I reached out to shake his hand. And he didn't really accept the idea to begin, but he shook my hand. And he looked around for permission as if it were from his friends. Can we talk? They looked at him and said, yeah, we're 7 of them. He's one. They kind of said, yeah, go ahead, talk to him. So I said, okay, but before we talk, can we have a hug? Whoa, that was a shocker for him. And again, he looked around to get approval. Yeah, so we started off with a hug. And the this hug dropped the level of animosity between us, and the discussion all of a sudden started out on another level. And by the time we were done 45 minutes later, we hugged again, but this time out of choice, because we understood that we still are humans and brothers who accept each other and have different opinions. And I don't accept their opinions or their implementation of their ideals by taking over hilltops throughout the West Bank. But now we can talk to each other. So it's not, again, like almost anything else, it's not unidimensional. And we have to relate to everybody as if they have an opinion and they are allowed to have their opinion. They're just not allowed to do things that are against the law. Violence, relating to people on a racist basis, whether they be Arabs against Jews or Jews against Arabs or anybody else. That's unacceptable. And you're allowed to maintain the idea. You can have whatever thoughts you want. No one's going to try to control your ideas or your thoughts, but you're not allowed to do things that are against the law. And the laws have to be such that prevent people from doing things against others simply because they are either of a certain belief, religion, color, or whatever. It's unacceptable. Can I just take a quick break here for a couple seconds?
Tell us about Bernie Sanders' time in Israel, because I always feel that you can't really talk about what's going on over there until you visit. And then people say, well, you have to visit the Palestinian side so you see how they're being oppressed. If you just visit Israel as a tourist, as an American, you're going to see all that stuff is going to be hidden. But wasn't Bernie there when there was still a lot of turmoil? And you mentioned the 67 war. There was a lot of Jews in America that were afraid that the state of Israel would be crushed, and they volunteered to go over there, and they volunteered to be part of the army. So that might be part of the reason that so many people are in favor of whatever policy the state of Israel comes up with, because they have that fear of annihilation, like complete destruction of the place. And so then that's why there's this like unwillingness to look at the problems. Like we're just going to support 100% because we could have another 6-day war. So how Jill Stein never said anything against the state of Israel, and that was one thing the progressives held against her. Bernie, in one of the debates, said, you know, there's racist in power in Israel or something like that. And to me, that was his demise with the Jewish support and the evangelical support. Can you expand? Where is he coming from, and what was his experience like?
Okay. Let's look back to when Bernie Sanders was a young man, trying to find out at that time, as I tried to find out later in the 60s, what I am about, where are my roots, what philosophies do I want to adopt, what kind of a lifestyle do I want to live. When you say there were volunteers that came with the memory of Israel possibly being crushed or whatever, the volunteers that came to Israel and volunteers in general in Israel were known to be volunteers to kibbutzim, not to either general society, especially not to the IDF. There were very few who came here as volunteers just to serve in the IDF and leave. I don't know of almost any. There were those that was true in 1948, where people came here in what was called machal, or the volunteers from overseas to help fight the War of Independence on the Israeli side. But since 1967, volunteers came to kibbutzim, and the kibbutzim existed for many, many years until privatization began, let's say until about 1995 or so, with groups of between 5 or 10 to possibly even 70 or 80 volunteers from various places around the world, not just Jews. Many volunteers came from Scandinavian countries, South America, wherever. And there are still people who come to volunteer in kibbutzim, but because they're privatized now, there's not much that they can actually do on a kibbutz. In any case, 1963-ish, young Bernie Sanders came to live on a kibbutz called Sha'ar Ha'amakim, which is just east of Haifa. I actually spent a few months there in 1971, 72. And from what I understand, he would finish his day of work, which he wasn't a great worker and didn't really fit in with the rest of the crew of pear pickers or whatever they were doing. And he would go to the office of the kibbutz to speak with the manager of the kibbutz, the managers, and try to understand what this socialism thing is. How does that work? I mean, it doesn't sound very logical or the usual thing to do for a human being, just to say, no, it's not for me, it's for all of us. That's where he began to understand that many of these people came together to be a community and to pool their resources toward a community lifestyle. And like I said, striving for an egalitarian lifestyle. And he saw that it worked. It was, that kibbutz was already there for 50 or 60 years before he arrived. And he began to understand the basis of not only socialism, but a working socialism, a voluntary socialism, not a socialism brought on by a Bolshevik revolution where if you were in that territory, you all of a sudden become a socialist because you're living in a socialist country. And if you don't like it, so there's alternatives, but you can't leave. This is, as I say to people, the gate of a kibbutz, of every kibbutz, is both the entrance and the exit. And no one's preventing you from leaving. So if you want to be part of a kibbutz, you have to be of the understanding that you are giving up your own personal wealth or resources to be part of everyone's. So when I came from Los Angeles in 1974, I came here without a car. I mean, we actually had to ask them, what are we allowed to bring with us? So they, car? No, obviously not a car. You need a car. We have the kibbutz pool of cars. You can reserve a car and you can take it. So can I bring a television? Say no. When you get to the order of the people in line for a television and your time comes, you'll get a television. There was only one station at the time in Israel, but that's beside the point. And so on and so forth. So for instance, very simply, we all worked according to our ability and gave to the community whatever we could give in terms of our own efforts and work, not just work, but in addition to that, our efforts for the community. And we got back what we needed, not what we desired. Nobody went to a kibbutz to buy Cadillacs or have fancy clothes or whatever. We lived a very modest lifestyle, and I was fine with that. I loved it. Bernie loved it also, studied it, developed it, brought it back to the United States, and said, the socialism thing is a good idea. It would be good for the people of the United States, in particular the have-nots. The 1% who have, they don't need socialism. In fact, they probably oppose it. But how about the have-nots, which is, almost everybody else, other than the gazillionaires, they want more because they don't have enough. Now, obviously, the lower classes need it more than the upper classes. But if you offer this kind of a thing to people as a choice, it's an important thing. It can really change the country. It can change humanity. And so kibbutz was, by the way, always striving to be the vanguard to humanity of showing how we can live together and cooperate, pool our resources. Whereas a farmer in Israel, not on a kibbutz, would get his plot of land of one, let's say, 50 acres, and neighbor would have another 50 acres, and that neighbor would have another neighbor with another 50, and all three of them would each, would each have their own tractor, their own irrigation system, their own harvesters. And as opposed to the three guys who went to the kibbutz who all had one tractor, 3 times the amount of land, but together, and they pooled their resources and they were able to purchase more cheaply. They were able to sell together better. And they pooled their resources into creating children's houses, a communal dining room. By the way, you'd really love not having to cook or wash the dishes after that or do your own laundry. It's really nice. I love doing it for others, by the way. That was a lot of fun. And I used to joke with people when I started working at Microsoft in the year 2000, it was before we privatized. So my salary went to the kibbutz, which was fine. And I had to actually request a car to take for that day. And if I didn't have a car, so I'd take public transportation. That was the idea. And Bernie I believe, has said, I don't believe, I've heard Bernie say over and over that he loves Israel. Does he love the state of Israel? Does he love the reality of the state of Israel or the policies of a certain government of the state of Israel? No, neither do I. I'm opposed to them. Isn't that interesting? So are about half of the people of the state of Israel, the citizens of the state of Israel, and not one thing, one entity, which we are either racist or whatever. So when Bernie speaks about Israel, and he does love Israel and he loves his Jewish people, and he also had family who perished in the Holocaust, and he understands the necessity of a homeland for the Jewish people. That doesn't negate the necessity for a homeland of Palestinians. That's fine. But he also says that if America has been giving Israel these economic benefits for so many years, totally blind to whether they are actually moving toward peace or striving toward peace, or striving at least to end the conflict with the Palestinians, there's something wrong with that. Now, Jews can support that because it's kind of natural. But what if you're not Jewish, like 98% of America? How can you justify that? So Bernie says that, if you're not going to go along with American policy, should we just continually support you? It doesn't make sense. On the other hand, do you just write off Israel as another country? That also doesn't quite make sense. So his attitude has always been that he supports Israel, but he would also support Palestine. And he supports the Palestinian people as he supports the Israeli people. As I said before, maybe I didn't state it properly, I believe that to be a supporter of Israel, you must also be a supporter of Palestine. One cannot win at the expense of the other, or both will lose. So this is his approach, which is different than almost any major candidate or candidate of any major party. Human and doing the right thing, and not just what you're expected to do. And he doesn't want to be told by people that because he's Jewish, he has to support this or believe that. He's doing the right thing. There is no such thing in socialism as racism. It doesn't work. It's non-existent. They're oxymorons.
Yeah.
Socialism is for everyone, whoever wants it. I'm not talking about a common. Excuse me.
Let's go there, because the interview that it's going to play before yours, so the week before, Rabbi Peter Tarlow says that the policies of Bernie Sanders are just like the policies of Hitler, and they use that to railroad him. So not only is he anti-Israel because he said that there should be respect for the Palestinians, now he is a proponent of Nazism because he wants everybody to have a car, everybody to have free school, and somehow all those things are evil, just like Nazism. So please unwrap that for us.
Okay. I don't believe that, again, anyone is evil. I believe that his attitude is one of striving toward equality among people, among races, among sexes, among nations, and that's fine. I don't think that anybody, unless you're actually living in the hills somewhere separate from most of humanity, I don't think that anybody wants to continue living without the things that they need or things that would make their life more pleasant. Taking in consideration the environment and other things, obviously, people should have what they need. And you know what? Maybe even a little more. It's nice that everybody should have a roof above their heads that will prevent being rained on or snowed on, that would give them cooling in the heat and warmth in the cold. I believe that they need food on their plates. I believe that everyone needs a decent education, if not even better, and should be able to progress and make their lives better, therefore making the lives of everybody else around them better. So these are the basics. But beyond that, television, to be in touch with the world. I don't think that's a bad idea to know what's going on, not necessarily that you must be glued to every single CNN soundbite or video piece, because that, although it is good to be in the know, doesn't mean you're going to understand things any better. You can't really understand the Palestine-Israel conflict from CNN or from MSNBC or anybody else, definitely not from Fox. but things don't just come across that way. You should have enough money to be able to buy books or be in contact with the internet. And there are many people in this country, as I imagine there are in the United States, who can't afford a high-speed connection or a decent computer or a good car or travel around the world or travel to Israel to see what Israel-Palestine really is. They can't get here. There are many people who can't. There are many people who can and don't do it. Many of us don't take advantage of everything that is available to us. But Bernie, I think, wants people to live a good life first, because there are so many people in the world who are in need. And I'm totally in favor of that. I don't think that there's the proper distribution of wealth. And when we say that, let's help our Likudnikan friends relax and say, no, we're not trying to steal your money. We're not going to be taking away your bank account. Take it easy. What we are saying is that taxes should be paid in a manner which everyone is taxed accordingly. Those who have more should be paying more. Those who have less should be paying less. That makes sense. And socialism itself is for the betterment of all. I, as a socialist, will not feel good, relaxed, enjoy my life if my neighbor is suffering because he doesn't have food on his table. That doesn't make sense to me. And it shouldn't make sense to anybody, in my opinion, because I can be high on the horse one day and flat on my face the next, as we've all noticed, especially since the virus has affected us all. People who thought that they were in a great position, had a wonderful profession or position in some great multinational company or whatever, suddenly they find themselves unemployed. And if they hadn't prepared for that, they're in trouble. They can lose their house. And then with what will they buy a new house, et cetera, all of a sudden everything has changed. And we've been warning of this for years, saying that life is great for those who have it great, but for those who don't have and don't have the ability to get because they don't have the employment opportunities and all of the rest like everybody else, that's a problem. And therefore, no one should feel threatened by socialism. They should look towards socialism as an opportunity to make it better for everyone and for the basis of a good life. And as the Washington Post said back, I believe it was in February, we're all socialists now. When everybody realized that nothing should be taken for granted, that our economic status and our economic continuing our economic lifestyle is not guaranteed by anybody. The health insurances are not going to be paid necessarily automatically and whatever. There should be health care for everybody. Every single human child deserves whatever he needs or she needs to live a healthy life. And suddenly, it's not in Israel, because we have socialized medicine, but in the United States, it's being denied to people, especially now since the coronavirus. Doesn't make sense. There are so many things so socialism and Bernie's way of looking at things should make sense to the majority of people, as we used to call it, the masses. And first, we have to take care of those who can't take care of themselves. We have a responsibility. If it's not going to be good for people of color in the United States, it's not going to be good for anybody. You cannot ignore the discrimination and the inability for others to live properly and just say, I've got mine, what do I care? That will last only so long. I hope I've addressed your question properly. I'm not sure I have.
Do you consider Israel a failed socialist experiment? Because, people point to Cuba, that was communist, not socialist. They point to Venezuela. They point to all these other socialist experiments that fell apart. And then when I question people about, well, if you're saying that socialism is Nazism, what about the socialism in Israel? And like, well, Israel was socialist only to a certain point, and then it couldn't survive, so now it became capitalist and something else. So where did it go wrong, or is socialism still alive and well, but in a different form? As you said, voluntary socialism versus force and the state funding the production method.
Unfortunately, I think socialism has been greatly, underappreciated. And as in the United States, where it never really got off the ground, it was looked at more or less as illegal and communism, socialism equals communism, which it doesn't. But in Israel, our so-called socialist governments that established the state weren't totally socialist. There was a racist element in them, both against Palestinians who lived here and also against Sephardic Jews, Jews who came from Arab countries, who were not Ashkenazi Jews, who came from mainly Western Europe. And these people were discriminated against. And today we're paying the price. I mean, today in August 2020, kibbutzim are being attacked because they have more, because they have swimming pools, because they have culture halls, because they have a stream that flowed through their kibbutz at the time. I'm talking specifically about one kibbutz right now where there's a major upheaval right on the Jordanian border, where a stream flowed through the kibbutz, and they very simply, because they were socialists and could pool their resources together, they developed it and they put cement around the edges and made it more like a swimming pool that flowed through flowing water, and put green grass around with trees and whatever. And now the people living in the development town next to the kibbutz, which is mainly Sephardic Jews and almost 100% right wing, they've come in and are physically attacking the kibbutz. They have physically opened the gate that was closed, opened the gate to run into the kibbutz and swim in the water and enjoy all of the wonderful things that the kibbutz built themselves. Now the kibbutz, it's true, the kibbutz place Jewish communities throughout the entire area of Israel that would eventually determine the borders of Israel. And the development towns did not get that priority. On the other hand, once they had that land, they then in a socialist way got together and pooled their resources to get more out of it. Like we talked about those three farmers. They did it in an economic manner that made it more viable and successful. To be angry at them for having been successful, to be angry at them that none of them wanted Cadillacs or colored televisions before anybody else, it's wrong. But today, it's being targeted. Kibbutzim throughout the country are being targeted as having been racist in the past, but that's not what most people are talking about. Today, we're coming to the level of when push comes to shove, and people are becoming more and more desperate to have food on the table. There are 1 million people in the country who are having real difficult economic times. There are over 500,000 people in a country of 9 million people who are unemployed, and that's totally unacceptable. Now, it can happen, but in a normal country or in a progressive country such as Denmark and other places, these are not socialist countries, but they are social democratic, and their ideas of how to get along take everyone into consideration. And therefore, if you're being laid off because the country has closed your means of production, your place of work, you should be compensated. So maybe not continue getting 100% of exactly what you were getting before, but 70% of your income should be provided to you by the state. That only makes sense. Not in Israel. And so people are having a rough time, and now the push is coming to shove. And people aren't yet starving, although I know of people who had decent work for 20 and 30 years and suddenly can't put food on the table in Israel. And that is totally unacceptable. I don't care who they are, where they're from, what their ideologies are, it doesn't matter. Socialism should be taking care of all of these people, everybody. Obviously, we don't have to take care of the people who have. But socialism is not attacking the rich, but just making our daily existence and our making policies to work for those who can't have at least the minimum and a little bit more. That's where we should be at. And the idea of socialism should not instill fear in anyone unless you've broken the law, say in the economic collapse of 2008, after which President Obama, who we all thought might do some rights to the wrongs that existed before then, he didn't prosecute any of the people who were responsible for the collapse or even made profits from the collapse. None of these people were prosecuted. That was wrong. A socialist would say, hey, buddy, you can't do that. That's wrong. Look how many thousands and thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of families across the United States are suffering as a result of your actions. at least one of you at the top of this corporation should be on trial. If not everybody who knew what was going on, everyone who's complacent or even contributed to these illegal actions. That's not right in any society, obviously not in a democratic society, where everybody is supposed to have an equal part in the society and don't. And we know that those often go along racial lines, color lines, religious lines, or whatever. So I don't accept that idea of coming down on Bernie because he's going to take people's wealth away, or for not being progressive enough and pushing anti-Israel, so to speak, policies or whatever. Things are far more complex than what Fox News will present to us. Let's remember that as we go along. You don't have to be a college professor to understand these things. You have to be aware. You have to be listening. You have to be looking for the truth, which isn't always obvious. We're being told so many lies nowadays in Israel and in the United States, especially by our Likudnikan leaders, where it's hard to differentiate between truth and lie. But you really, if you want to know down the line, when something hits you that you don't expect, you want to know what the truth is to be able to deal with it and how to vote in the next election. You got to be in the know. Did I just make a plug for MSNBC? Be in the know. Anyway, in my opinion, you got to be in the know. You've got to care and you've got to do something. You cannot wait until it hits you in the face. You have got to be proactive about your democracy. It's not just your right. It's your responsibility, according to the Constitution, to do certain things, even if it comes down to overthrowing your own government. I'm not saying you should overthrow your government, but you should not allow your government to get to the situation where that's even a consideration.
Let's talk about racism, because we've hinted at it throughout the conversation. And, commonly speaking, anti-Semitism is a form of racism, but some people try to say that it's its own particular form and it's this illogical hatred that people have. But we've seen throughout different cultures that there's always favoritism to groups that are lighter than others, or who have more resources or more education and things like that. So one time in a presentation, I said that if you ever catch a Jew being racist, it's because they learned it from their captors or their oppressors. And what I meant was that in the Spanish community where I come from,
I don't know if you could hear it, but my stomach just went, ugh, when you said that.
Well, in the Spanish-Portuguese community, when they landed in Mexico, they only married among themselves. Right. And it was part of like a biblical mandate to keep not the race pure or the blood pure like other groups, but to keep the mores and the values and to pass them on to the next generation. So everybody does that. Right. But the idea of racism.
Everybody did that. Let's hope that isn't a continuation. But yes.
Well, but nowadays where everybody is a little more enlightened and everybody has access to similar information, you would think that we would be more open and people can jump from one group to another or be assimilated to whatever group they want to be of, whatever. But racism in itself is the hatred of the unknown, of the other. So I think that part of the maybe issue in the Middle East is that European culture always had this almost like a fetish with Orientalism and
a superiority complex.
And that Jews grew up around that and they brought that with them. So, but you will also see in New York, I remember one of the professors telling me that there was a Sephardic, a Spanish descendant hospital, and then there was an Ashkenazi hospital, and they wouldn't go to each other's hospitals because they didn't trust whoever was running. So instead of thinking of because people are going to say, well, maybe there's something innate in Judaism or in the Jewish people for them to be discriminatory against other groups. Would you say that it's just a human thing, or there's something of feeling that superiority because of whatever reason? Or is it just this idea of you fear what you don't understand and you pick fights with people for random issues and for resources? Sometimes I feel it's more geopolitical than it is religious in nature or race-based. What would you say?
I'll go back to what I said in the very beginning. There are so many different flavors of, different types of. when you say the Jews brought that with them to the Middle East or whatever, don't forget there were many, many, I don't know the percentages, of Jews who came to help establish and live in the state of Israel, who came from Arab countries, who came from what is called Sephardic areas around the entire Mediterranean, including North Africa, areas like Iraq and Iran. Many Jews came from Iraq and Iran. These weren't ideas that came only from Western Jews, number one. Number two, I said back in the very beginning that I love the differences between people. This is the spice of life. This is not a reason to hate. This is a reason to love. I love Mexican food. I love Arabic food. I love Arabic music. I love to dance debka. These are the differences between us should not be a reason to hate or for prejudice. If anyone in the world should understand racism, it must be the Jews. Half of us, 6 million of us, were killed, murdered because of racism. It wasn't because we had different opinions, although there were millions who were also killed because of different opinions. Communists and homosexuals, etc., were massacred alongside of us. But Jews who even never considered themselves to be Jewish, this is already after the time of so-called Enlightenment when Reform Judaism existed. There were people like myself who didn't consider themselves religious whatsoever. There were people who didn't consider themselves Jews. Unfortunately, they burned in the same oven. Now, I'm not saying that that should be the reason for being racist. I consider this is an important thing, in my opinion, of the lessons of the Holocaust. I believe that there are, I'm being simplistic here, I believe that there are two ways that people take the Holocaust, two lessons to be learned, or two ways people take those lessons. One is to say, hey, you other people, you killed 6 million of us? Guess what? I'm going to be the toughest motherfucker on the block from now on. You even look my way, I'm going to chop your head off. I don't buy that. I believe that as a person who has suffered this horrific event in history, one of the worst events in history, and I'm not going to start comparing them, but as a person who lost half of his people, as an individual who lost family to racism, I will never be racist about or to anybody in the future. No one should be racist. We, the Jews in particular, must be on guard against racism against anybody, and in particularly not be racist ourselves or allow our understanding of different races, colors, religions, whatever, to be something that we would hold against anybody. That is the, I believe, the right lesson to learn from the Holocaust. It is extremely upsetting to me, obviously disappointing, that any Jew should be racist against anybody else, or to use that racism to show superiority, or to impose his views or laws against anybody. There's a country, there's a people. There are many people within a country. There are many people within one people in the country. And all of these have to be respected. And we all have to try to have a mutuality of understanding that we must move together and try to embellish the differences between us. Try to, way back, it used to be considered an important thing for every Israeli to go into the army because it's the unifying factor and gives everybody more or less an entrance to the melting pot. I don't want a melting pot. I want different pots, and each pot can have various flavors. It's wonderful. And therefore, I don't accept that idea of prejudice. I have to say, again, I'll refer to that term that I used before of justified paranoia. I'll just use this quick example. There's a monastery on the top of Mount Carmel, where if you know about it, you'll go up to the top and stand on the roof of the monastery. And from that monastery, if you look to the west, you see the hills of the Mount Carmel, the forests of the Carmel floating down toward the Mediterranean Sea. And you see the end of the country on the west. If you turn to the east, you see the Jezreel Valley, I mean, you're at a very, very high place, one of the highest places in Mount Carmel. You see beneath you the Jezreel Valley and huge fields of kibbutzim and moshavim, which is a less socialistic form of a communal lifestyle. And the little, what's it called? I forget what you call rivers that don't exist in desert areas when it's not raining. Arroyos secos that would eventually flow towards, instead of toward the Mediterranean, they flow to the east toward the Jordan River and eventually toward the Dead Sea or the Sea of Galilee, depending on how far north they are. But you can actually see across all of the Jezreel Valley, look through this saddle, which has Mount Tabor on one side, which appears in the Bible, and the Gilboa, which appears on the other side. Through this saddle, on a nice clear day, you can actually see Jordan, today's Jordan. In other words, you're not looking through occupied territory. You're looking through the north of Israel, not at its narrowest point, and you can actually see the neighboring country. In other words, you can see the borders of your country from one place. I don't know how big Houston is, or Nashville, I know more or less is not a huge city. But if you could actually see the border of your country from standing at the center of Nashville, you got to be careful. And when I say that wasn't the narrowest place, there were places where it was only 10, 14 miles wide, the country, the borders of Israel before 1967. So that there was this fear that eventually they could cut us in half, in which case it would just be a matter of time before they pushed us into the sea, which was what we've been told that they want to do all these years and whatever. So there is this justified paranoia. And I say that instead of always being on guard and being the strongest motherfucker in the block, I think it's time that we started figuring out how to move on. Let's cut to the chase. Let's move to the next stage and start being friends. I was not a person who approved of economic solutions to the issue, to the problems, to the conflict, for instance. But in the same building where I worked in the medical device industry, there was a company called Mellanox, an Israeli company which formed right there. That's where they started. They opened up a branch in Nazareth specifically for Arab programmers and people of that Arab city, the largest Arab city in the north, to work in high tech. And after that, they opened up a branch in Ramallah, Palestine, the head of the Palestinian Authority. Most Israelis didn't get that. Guess what they did next? They actually opened a branch in Gaza. Oh, heaven forbid, Gaza, our enemy, our people who launch rockets against. You opened an office of a high-tech company in Gaza? Yeah. And guess what? They do good work. Why shouldn't they? Why shouldn't we employ them? Why shouldn't we find economic friendship? I'm now in favor of any way of bridging gaps. My work with the Muslim Member of Knesset, Zohair Bahlul, was all about bridges. He's a person who, his Hebrew is so eloquent that it puts most Israelis to shame. It's almost Shakespearean Hebrew. And he used to be the play-by-play announcer for Israeli soccer, and even wrote the Israeli Encyclopedia of Soccer. When you hear him give this play-by-play, you look at the station, you say, wait a minute, am I listening to ballet or am I listening to a soccer match? It was wonderful. This guy is a person of building bridges. Unfortunately, he left the parliament. He quit the Knesset when the nation state law was approved that more or less established Jewish dominance in almost every field in the state of Israel. More than half of the country opposed it, but it got passed.
Last question. So I sent you a paper I wrote about Zionism and the establishment of the state of Israel. And there was one particular progressive, you could call them opposer or critic of the state of Israel. And he's very radical. What he said is that
I don't know if he considers himself radical, but okay, yeah.
Well, he says he's an ex-Jew. And his whole premise
I'm sorry, you broke up here. I can't hear you.
He considers himself an ex-Jew. He's an Israeli writer. And he says that you say that it's great to have many pots and to have the diversity of ethnic groups and culture and stuff like that. He says that there shouldn't be any at all. He says that if you're truly democratic, you should be like the basic 3 elements of the French Revolution. It should be liberty, equality, and fraternity. And that means that everybody should give up their national, ethnic, and religious identity, and we should just all be humans. How is that even possible? Because that's the standard that he judges Israel by. Since Israel, being a democracy, is not that, then it should be dismantled and done away with. How is that utopian dream not even possible? Because I don't think it is, but that's the standard that he's using, and it's funny he doesn't use that for any other country other than it.
Okay, as far as extreme or radical, I know that there are many people in Israel who consider me to be extreme and radical. I don't consider myself either extreme or radical. In terms of the left, I consider myself to be more or less right in the middle of the left. I'm not a liberal, I'm a progressive. I'm not an extremist. But let's put those categories aside for a second. If I could press a button, I'd have one world tomorrow. End of story. Great, let's all live in peace. It's going to be a little hard to implement. There's going to be a lot of conflict along the way until we bridge those gaps between us. Regarding Israel-Palestine, I'm in favor of one state, but not now, not yet. We can't live together as two states. We're not even living together as one state with another person or entity on the side. These are processes. And we have to go through various stages before we can all dance a debka or a hora together. I'd love to see that day. I hope I live to see the day, and I do dance debkas, and I have Arab friends who will dance a hora. That's not the problem. It's not a press button thing. And therefore, I am a supporter of the two-state solution. I don't oppose the one-state solution. I just don't think it's implementable at this point. I hope to get to the day where it's implementable. And as I say, I don't approve of the Israeli flag. I don't approve of the Israeli national anthem. I'm pushing to have them changed immediately, because when we say Palestinians, let's not forget there are Palestinian Israelis and there are Palestinians who are not Israelis. There are Palestinians who live in the United States, in Germany, in Palestine, in Syria, wherever. But let's not just say the Palestinians, because they are also multifaceted, just like Jews are multifaceted. There, as you said, this Jew who doesn't consider himself necessarily a Jew anymore, definitely not an Israeli anymore, or whatever. That's fine. I don't. Everybody has their right to determine their own category or definition or whatever. That's not the problem. The problem is when we look for the differences between us as something to keep us apart. I don't think we can get to that point of implementation of a one state. I actually, I won't say I took part in the negotiation of, but I was the post-publication editor of the Geneva Initiative Final Status Agreement, which was written by two groups, one of Israelis, one of Palestinians, prominent members of each society, including generals, and even we had an Israeli chief of staff from the IDF who took part in this process. And they sat together and negotiated a peace settlement as if they were representing their governments, which they weren't absolutely representing, but they were there with the knowledge of their governments. Abu Mazen was the person who sent the Palestinian delegation. And these groups sat together until each side had given more and more, given up, had relinquished certain established facts or understandings to the point where each side just said, wait a second, I can't give up anymore. I mean, no matter what solution I suggest, no matter what peace settlement I sign, it has to be supportable by the people in each of these states for it to succeed. Otherwise, it's not even worth its weight in the ink on the paper. So they sat together and actually came up with a peace settlement. And I edited the entire thing. I dotted every I and crossed every T throughout the whole thing and did all of the numbering that was incorrect about it all. And I did all the work on it. So I know the entire settlement. I totally support it. That was in 2003. That was after the Pan-Arab peace initiative that came before that recognized the state of Israel, its right to exist, and obviously a state of Palestine. And if conservative, right-wing, Likudnikan Jews tell you that we won't do anything until the Arabs approve the recognize the state of Israel and its right to exist in secure borders, da, da, da. That's already been done. That's passed. Move on. Even Hamas has accepted the idea of a legitimate state of Israel with its right to exist, etc., as long as they have their rights also accepted. Now, Palestine also is a problem unto itself in that you have one entity in Gaza, another entity in the West Bank, and maybe other entities around the world. That doesn't mean they can't get together when it will become necessary. That doesn't mean that once our leaders finally sit down and actually take the Geneva Initiative or whatever peace plan they want, I don't care, and start negotiating it in an honest manner, in respect for each other. I don't care which. You know what? If you don't like the Geneva Initiative, bring another one. As long as you can convince its leaders to use that as their roadmap, as long as you can convince the people after it's been signed that this is what they should support, let's go. Let's do it. In my opinion, the Geneva Initiative, if tomorrow Netanyahu were able to say, I will sit with Abu Mazen, according to his prerequisite that someone else is in the room with us. That's the only prerequisite that Abu Mazen has in speaking to Netanyahu. I think that it's a matter of 2 to 3 months and we can live in peace as brothers, not just cousins, as brothers in this area, in this region, in this land, however you want to call it, however you want to divide it. We can live next to each other. Wonderful people. I have friends in the PLO. I have friends who oppose the PLO. I taught computers to a man in Gaza who was a supporter of Hamas before they really came to power. It can be done. We don't have to live by the sword, as Netanyahu says. There are alternatives. To begin with, every Israeli Jew must learn Arabic. And I took part in a kindergarten here, becoming a dual language kindergarten where the Arabs learn also Hebrew and the Jews also learn Arabic. And they go home to their parents and start talking to their parents in the other language. Their parents look at them like, what did you say? It's wonderful. It really is wonderful. And there are more and more like that throughout the country. And once we understand the other person's language and their culture and their background and their history, it's much easier to be able to agree with them and come to a mutual understanding and map of progress for both. So it is possible. And whoever considers themselves opposed to one side is also opposed to the other. You cannot expect, we're not leaving, Jews are not leaving, and neither are Palestinians, nor should they, nor should we. Okay, I came here under a pretense that wasn't entirely truthful to begin with, but I came here with, I think, like I would come to any other country in the world, to live amongst all the rest of the citizens in peace and in recognition of mutuality. Before we get to, let's say, an actual mutual future between Israel and Palestine, we're going to have to go through a reconciliation process. It's a must. Just like in South Africa, Jews have to come forward and tell what they did, even if it was wrong, especially if it was wrong. The same thing for Palestinians. And that's already existing, by the way. There is an organization of the bereaved families of both Israelis and Palestinians. There is an organization of former combatants, Israelis and Palestinians, who work together in each of these organizations. And we actually hold a mutual Memorial Day commemoration. On the Memorial Day of Israel, we get together in Tel Aviv, thousands and thousands of people, to recognize the pain of ours and of the other who were our enemies, in an effort to understand and be compassionate about their pain, understand it, accept it, and to look forward toward not causing any more pain one to the other. And we are hated, we are spat upon literally, we are threatened literally by people from the right wing. As we enter this space where we hold the ceremony every year, it's gotten larger and larger every year. I think we had 15,000 people before Corona. 15,000 Israelis, Palestinian Israelis also came. And we have a very meaningful and respectful memorial commemoration. This is where the things must start, in recognizing the other, because we are the other's other. And there's no sense in hating the other, but rather accepting, learning about, and even loving the other.
Well, we want to thank you for your time, and I know there's still things developing with annexation and other political things going on. So maybe we can have you back if that ever goes through, or if more challenges come your way. So, but it's been very enlightening, and we will be broadcasting this in 2 parts on our radio station and in the full version on YouTube. But it's always good to learn from the wisdom of people who have been in the trenches and who are fighting to bring peace among different groups. So thanks again for being part of our show.
My pleasure, my honor. Peace to everyone. Thank you.
Same to you. Take care.
Thank you.